Hi, it's Brad Saunders. I'm the CEO at Community Living Toronto, and welcome back to Community Chats. Today, Brendon Pooran is back, and we have a wide-ranging conversation on a number of issues, including updates on MAID, the medical assistance in dying, particularly as it applies to individuals with an intellectual disability, some of the risks there. Talk about the disability tax credit, changes that have been made to make that easier to access and maintain. We also touch on the Canada Disability Benefit, as well as supported decision making. Brendon and I cover a lot of ground, take a bit of time, but I'm sure whether you're a family member or a self-advocate, a professional, or simply interested in building a more inclusive society, really think this conversation will help give you some good perspective and practical insights. So grab a coffee or a bottle of water, settle in, and let's chat, because belonging begins with listening. Brendon, thanks for joining us today. Good to have you back, I think for the third time.
Nice to be here, Brad. Good to see you. Yeah, I think this is number 3.
Yeah.
Lucky number 3.
You're always a popular guest, and there's always lots to talk about. So we'll get to that. But first of all, how's the summer going? We're doing this in July and sort of halfway through. How are things?
Yeah, summer's going okay. It's flying by. I mean, I think we say that every year, but I do think that that time is going by even quicker this summer. So hard to believe that July is almost over, but can't complain. Weather's been great.
Yeah, weather's been slow to come, but weather's been excellent. So that's good to be part of. Dive right in here. So I thought we have a few things we're going to talk about, but and it feels, because there's been progress on a couple of things that I think are noteworthy, which is why we were really keen to have you back. First thing we'll start with is MAID, which is medical assistance in dying. Sure. And we've talked about this a couple times on the podcasts, and get lots of questions from people. And I hear a lot of feedback that that's very helpful, because it is an issue, obviously very sensitive. It's still evolving, particularly track 2. And then it has a lot of importance to our sector because of the risks that are there for people that we support, or people living with an intellectual disability and others. So there was a big development towards the end of the last session of the House of Commons of Parliament, where a recommendation was made to not fully implement the track 2 recommendations that were being done. Mm-hmm. What happened?
So maybe I'll
and you know what? Maybe we should just back up one step. So
Sure.
I skipped over a whole lot there. So maybe start with, what is, first of all, MAID has 2 tracks. What is track 1? What is track 2?
Yeah, the main difference between track 1 and track 2 is that with track 1, the individual applying for MAID is doing so based on having a condition that will result in a reasonably foreseeable death. Under track 2, that requirement of the reasonable foreseeable death does not have to be there, right? So we're talking about someone who has a essentially an irremediable condition, but that condition is not necessarily leading them to a reasonably foreseeable death. So there's that piece. There's track 2, when there's currently sort of a constitutional challenge associated with track 2, but there's also the status of, where the federal government is at with mental illness as the sole underlying medical condition to request MAID.
Okay, so just so we're clear, so track 1 would be, you receive a cancer diagnosis, you're given a period of time, life expectancy. You can arrange with a physician that you want to end your life with medical assistance, and that's the bulk. That's most people that use MAID are on that track 1, where it's a diagnosis that you've got, you're not gonna recover, and you choose to do medical assistance in dying instead of going so going through whatever that might endeavor.
Where your natural death is then reasonably foreseeable.
Okay. And then track 2, and the history of track 2 is, so this could be chronic conditions, chronic pain, ongoing conditions that
Yep.
people can't live with, don't want to live with, or whether it was
Yeah, well, they're saying that they don't want to live with whatever the manifestations are of their condition, whatever the
right.
symptoms are of their condition. And yeah, I mean, you cited some good examples there. Chronic pain is a common example that we hear from people who are saying, look, my death isn't, I don't have I have a grievous and irremediable condition, but not one that would lead me to, at least now, to a reasonably foreseeable death. But when I'm experiencing these symptoms, when I'm experiencing these manifestations, they're intolerable. And therefore, they're wanting to apply for MAID.
Okay. And in the disability community, the concern is that that would be so broadly applied that people may make choices that are not fully informed, or that other people may influence that decision. There's just a lot of risk there that people are in the disability community are very uncomfortable with, not just disability, but in mental
Yeah.
health as well, that people are not comfortable with.
Yeah, I think there are a few factors or a few considerations being cited, and you've picked up on a few of them. One is undue influence, right? Like, is this something that the person actually wants or are they being unduly influenced by so-called trusted family members or friends or
Right.
other third parties? And unfortunately, that is a real thing. Like we have worked on cases involving MAID at our office where there have been um, allegations that this wasn't really the person's choice, but they may have been unduly influenced by family members who had ulterior motives. There's the informed consent piece, right? So making absolutely certain that the person requesting MAID is providing that informed consent. And so, sort of unpacking the whole area of consent capacity and legal decision making within the healthcare context. And we have
Right.
fairly robust legislation that governs informed consent. So that's a concern. There's also a concern that's often raised around um, people requiring supports as a result of their disability, right? So, and this was even a factor that was cited in the report delivered by the Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying here, with respect to people with mental illness as a sole underlying condition. Like, are there adequate supports and services in place for people, right? Or are people opting for MAID due to there being a lack of supports? And if there were the right level of supports in place, perhaps MAID wouldn't be pursued in some situations. So, yeah, a number of factors
It's
that are
pretty.
being raised by the community.
Yeah, we've one of the examples that we've seen, or impacts that we've seen lately in the housing that we've done in the last number of years, is how dramatically a person's life can change by their living circumstance, their living situation changing.
Mhm.
And we've had people on our podcast and with our influencers across community living Toronto talking about the impact that just moving from a place where that was, a basement apartment in not a great neighborhood with neighbors that weren't the best, or they were scared to be in their communities, to a place that was with adequate support in a different building that had people they knew, that sense of community, and that changed their perspective. Now, I don't know that anybody was pursuing MAID, but it did.
Right.
You did see a dramatic increase in people's level of happiness, level of satisfaction, reduced reliance on the healthcare system. So I guess this is just sort of extending that further. Are there circumstances where a person would, because the supports they don't have, they would choose to say, I don't want to do this, I don't want to live anymore? And that, I think we could all agree, is not something we as Canadians
Yeah.
would get behind.
Should not be a reason to pursue MAID. And we've heard numerous stories in the media over the years about people requesting supports on numerous occasions due to their underlying condition and just not being able to access the right types of supports. And you again alluded to one that most is most commonly referred to, and that's housing, right? Just
Right.
inaccurate housing supports for folks, for people generally, right? For people living
Yeah.
below the poverty line. But then when there is some sort of condition or disability involved here, being able to be accommodated within the housing space, being able to live
Yeah.
comfortably, being able to not be as socially isolated as they otherwise would be.
Yeah.
That being cited as a factor for pursuing MAID.
Okay. One thing just to clarify, I think sometimes the medical community can get painted with a broad brush
Mhm.
around how they deal with people with disabilities when it comes to significant conditions, end of life care, or just really serious conditions that are requiring time. I mean, there's lots of stories out there where people have been told, quite harsh things about, well, you have a disability. Do you really want to continue living? And I've certainly been part of those conversations with doctors themselves, and
Yes.
people will advocate against that. However, that is not the universal experience of people. And we've worked with a lot of doctors, nurses, hospitals, where they do everything they can to support a person, try and bring them back to health. And if a decision is made to end, if someone's on life support, that decision is arrived at reluctantly and carefully. So I don't know that we can put everybody in a basket and say, oh, because you have a disability, you're just fundamentally going to be in this track, or you're going to be recommended that, because that's not been certainly my experience.
No, I agree with you. We definitely cannot generalize about the medical community, and I think, like you, I think I've experienced both ends of the spectrum when it's come to supporting people. But at the end of the day, I mean, the medical community does act as a gatekeeper for a number of sort of um, fundamental supports available
Right.
to people with disabilities, right? Like not only within the MAID context, like obviously they're instrumental with MAID, but they act as gatekeepers when it comes to sort of accessing the disability tax credit, right? Accessing the Canada Disability Benefit, accessing provincial social assistance supports quite often. So it's very important, I would say, to have the medical community on board, to partner with the medical community as much as possible, to educate, to raise awareness,
Right.
to really, like I said, treat them as a partner within the process.
Okay. So just to go back then, the next steps are, so this recommendation was made to Parliament by the committee studying it at the end of the last session. Where does it go from here?
So that, yeah, and that to be clear, that's on the expansion of MAID to include um, mental
Right.
illness
So
as the sole
track one
underlying
is
condition.
set and clear, and it's remaining. It's the
Right.
track two stuff, and
So a bit of a nuance, right? So
okay.
expansion of MAID to include um, uh, mental illness as the sole underlying condition. So I would treat that as sort of one outstanding matter, and that's the main sort of consideration right now before
Right.
the joint committee. I would say that and advanced directives. Um, the committee in their latest report, which I believe was issued last month,
Right.
essentially said that, you know, accessing MAID based on mental illness as a sole underlying condition should be excluded. Like that should not be considered.
Right.
So that's not a binding decision by any means, but that recommendation has now come out. We were expecting, I think, mental illness as a sole underlying condition to be implemented come March of 2027.
Okay.
So we're not sure, based on this recommendation, where things stand with respect to mental
Okay.
illness.
And
Yeah.
then we use the term mental illness, but it's not clear from the disability context whether that includes intellectual disability or how broadly what that category encompasses. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say, I mean, my interpretation, and don't hold me to this, would be that I don't know that it would necessarily include someone with solely an intellectual disability, right?
Okay.
Like maybe if there's a
Okay.
dual diagnosis involved or something along those lines, but I don't
Okay.
think the intent is to include um, people with intellectual
Okay.
disabilities
Okay.
generally. I think we're talking about more sort of mental health related conditions.
Okay. So more to come on that.
Yeah. And so there's the mental illness piece, and then there's the track two. There's a
Right.
constitutional challenge that's been initiated in the Ontario courts, of which Inclusion Canada is actually part of the coalition that is essentially suggesting that track two is unconstitutional, right? That the track two should be struck down, and litigation is in its early stages. So we'll have to wait to see how
Okay.
things sort of transpire there. But that's sort of I would say, the second update
Okay.
that I'd have to share with you
Good.
related to MAID.
Yeah. That is helpful. More to come.
Yeah.
Disability tax credit and eligibility. Big changes coming there with the last, was it the budget or
It was the spring economic
statement? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's new?
I would say the most significant change that impacts our community or people with intellectual disabilities would be changes introduced to lifelong certifications for qualifying individuals. So historically, some people applying for the disability tax credit who had a lifelong condition, let's say some form of intellectual disability, would apply, they'd be successful, but with their approval letter came a sort of an expiry date. Right. So the disability tax credit is good for 3 years or 5 years. So you've got to reapply at 18 because something magically changes at age 18. That's no longer the case for certain conditions, including conditions related to intellectual disability. So a lifelong certification's in place. Qualified practitioner just needs to convey the diagnosis. They don't necessarily have to explain how the diagnosis has an impact on the person's life. And then the individual would not need to reapply again, which is a huge win for many people. It's a stressful process to kind of go through applying for the DTC and then having to diarize it to reapply in 3 years or 5 years and track down a qualified practitioner and put all of your paperwork together. If you miss the deadline, then all of the benefits associated with the disability tax credit, like the refundable tax credits, the
Right.
RDSP, all of those pieces are sort of put on hold. So I think this was big. This is very much welcomed, I think, by the community. So there was that. The list of qualified practitioners who could sort of sign off on the DTC was expanded a little bit. I think podiatrists are now included, and also the list of the types of disabilities that could be approved by physiotherapists and speech language pathologists and OTs has been broadened.
Right.
Like that's been expanded, so that's making life a little bit easier. And then the third piece is that for people who are under the PGT's guardianship of property, the PGT can now certify folks,
Okay.
right? So they don't have to go out and get a medical practitioner to sign off on the applications.
Now that was something that I hadn't caught in the when this sort of initially came out. So how is very clear on how that would work?
I don't know how they're operationalizing this. I guess the thinking behind it was that the individual went through a formal capacity assessment in order for the PGT to become involved, and therefore there's enough information in that capacity assessment that would be analogous to or satisfy the requirements of the DTC. So why put them through that process again with a qualified medical practitioner?
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is good. We so the form, I heard a lot about this a month ago when it was first sort of announced, right? The form was 14 or 18 pages long, had to be done by a doctor.
Yeah.
Doctors did not like doing it.
Yeah.
But also, it sometimes charged for it but then didn't like doing that either because the person often didn't have the money for it. So it was a real hassle to go through.
I think things have been improved. I'll say the one major issue that is still out there that really does impact people with intellectual disabilities is the legal representation piece.
Okay.
Right. So if the CRA doesn't think that you are capable of applying for the DTC yourself, there are no real mechanisms in place for a trusted family member or friend to assist with that. So we still get calls regularly from, let's say, parents who are just trying to, their daughter turned 18. She now has to reapply. They're trying to reapply for her. The DTC's been in place for 15 years, and they're being told they can't do it. They can't do it
Right.
without pursuing legal guardianship because they don't have the legal authority to act on their daughter's behalf. So that's still a significant problem.
So let's come to that in a sec. So because that sort of gets into supported decision making and some of the other pieces that
Sure.
you've certainly been advocating for many years. The disability tax credit and all those expansions that is in effect now, that did pass. So those provisions are now in effect.
I believe they're all in effect. Yeah.
They are working. I will say government, I would agree. I think government is quite proud of this change. It's a small but not insignificant change. We did a press conference about a month ago with Secretary of State Wayne Long and our MP Danielle Martin, who is a physician herself. And when she was speaking at this, talked about how much of an unnecessary step she felt it was. And I can't speak on her behalf, but that was sort of my impression, that long forms, lots of time for a condition that wasn't going to change. So I'm a big believer in giving props where deserved. And this was a change that is making things easier for some people, recognizing it's not everything.
Definitely a step forward, and I would say formalized a practice that had historically been in place with the CRA. I would say predating the RDSP in 2008. We used to see a lot more of these sort of lifelong certificates issued, and that wasn't happening very much over the last 10 or 15 years. So definitely, I agree with you. Like it's great to see this formalized. It's going to make life easier for a lot of people.
Good. We'll come back to supported decision making in that in a minute, but I just wanted, the other piece that's sort of along these lines is the disability, the Canada Disability Benefit. And we've talked about this as a payment. It's $150 or $200?
$200, up to $200
up to $200 a month. It was initially talked about years ago when it was started as being a mechanism to lift people with disabilities to move them out of poverty. So in Ontario, if you're on ODSP, which is $1,400 a month or so, it tends to be, in a city like Toronto, less than half the rate of poverty, what you're receiving as income. So many people, just by having a disability, if that was their only source of income, they were living in poverty. That the Canada Disability Benefit did not meet expectations. It's quite a bit lower than was needed. But it's there. There was sort of hinting that the $200 isn't set forever. It could change over time. There's advocacy work that people could do there. How's it going since it rolled out, and what's your experience been, or the people your clients in that?
A couple of things, just sort of picking up on what you had just mentioned with respect to the amount of the benefit. So it is up to $200 a month. It definitely didn't meet expectations in terms of what a lot of us thought it was going to be, because it was very much touted as a mechanism to lift people out of poverty. But the framework legislation is in place, right? So we're not looking at needing to advocate for legislative change here in order to increase the amount of the benefit, right? The legislation's in place. I think with some advocacy, we can, hopefully convince the federal government to increase that amount over time, because it is, as you mentioned, it's just grossly inadequate right now. Does it help? It definitely helps when, if your sole source of income is only $1,400, or I think it's $1,436 now a month. Mm-hmm. But it could have a much more significant impact if it was funded adequately. I think an issue that I think you and I had spoken about in the past with respect to the CDB was the access piece. And I just must be magnetic or something, because I keep on coming back to the whole, legal representative issue and supported decision making. But the access piece has been difficult for some people with intellectual disabilities. because of, quite honestly, just the same barrier that's in place there, similar barriers that are in place there when compared to accessing the DTC or accessing the RDSP, right? It's this whole notion of if you cannot apply yourself independently, right? If you require any type of support, CRA, Service Canada has very little in place, from my standpoint at least, to assist you with that application process.
Mhm.
Now, depending on where you live, in what province or what territory you live in, there may be legislation in place that provides for, I guess I'm getting into supported decision making, but
It's
provides for
fine,
support.
and I don't mean to keep
Yeah,
you away from it. I just,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that provides for sort of decision making. So this isn't necessarily an issue, but for folks here in, let's say, in Ontario, where we don't have any supported decision making legal frameworks in place, people can't open an RDSP. They can't renew their DTC. They can't access the CDB if there are questions related to their contractual capacity.
Right. So, okay, so let's dive into, well, let's wrap that on. So Canada
Sure.
Disability, it started up to $200 a month.
Yep.
It feels like there, anytime something new starts, there's a period of disruption, understand, and it sounds like that's going okay. There is opportunity for it to increase over time. And the other piece that I think is worth mentioning is there's no clawback. That in Ontario, and I don't know that any provinces have clawed back, because initially they were talking about that if you're receiving ODSP as an example and you got a $200 benefit, that they would claw that back from your ODSP or 50% of it,
right?
Which
No
was
benefit.
absurd. So I'm glad to see that didn't get any traction, because early on I think it was a real concern. And I think it was a real policy consideration at some point. So it's good to see we got away from that.
Yep.
It's frustrating to me as somebody that does advocacy in this area, where disability services is the area I probably do most of this in. There's no money. It's not the time. Economy's low, or economy's good, but it's not time, at whatever it is. But at the same time, when we need to spend up our military spending from 1.35% to 2%, and then to 3.5% and 5%, you can do that at a drop of a hat. And I go, we're not comparing apples and apples, but it's just incredibly frustrating. And it really does sort of go back to this view of societies prioritize what's important to them. So if military spending is an existential issue for the country, we can find the money. And I think us in the disability community, need to keep that in mind as well. If they prioritized disability services and supporting people who are vulnerable in our country, it should get more profile. But we choose where we invest our money. We choose where we spend.
Yeah, and the optimist in me will say that that profile has raised over the last 10 or 15 years.
I would agree.
It's nowhere near where we need it to be, but I mean, the country ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2010. It introduced the RDSP, the Registered Disability Savings Plan, in 2008, and it passed the Accessible Canada Act. In 2019, it introduced the Canada Disability Benefit a few years ago. And these initiatives were initiated by different governments across the political spectrum. So I think overall we are moving in the right direction.
That's
for sure.
True, and that's true. And certainly in Ontario, this government has invested pretty consistently as well. So with that, supported decision making. So help me understand that. For simple context, my son just turned 18. It's shocking to me that he can now go into a bank or a real estate office and say, here I am. I want to buy this or sign this or lease this, and just pick up a pen and sign on the dotted line. And the qualifying factor for him is that he's turned 18. And that's set. If you have a disability, it's not as simple always. So walk us through this.
Sure. And I'll just try to give you some very clear examples without getting too theoretical or legal in nature. And I think I've identified a few of them over the course of the last hour. But we start with the premise, the legal premise, that everyone is presumed to be capable of making their own decisions at certain ages, right? So when it comes to signing a contract or managing property, as you alluded to, that's age 18. So that's where the law
Right.
starts, right? The law doesn't start by saying because you have an intellectual disability, you're incapable of making that decision. You got to presume the person's capable. And then if there's a decision to be made and there's evidence to suggest that the person may not be capable, that's when we start getting into the question of who can step in and make a decision for them, right? So that is just a very sort of high level description of what we call substitute decision making. It's black and
Right.
white. Person's capable or not. If they're not capable, then they have a substitute decision maker. Steps into their shoes and makes a decision for them. What the law doesn't do in Ontario is recognize the fact that we all need different levels of support when it comes to decision making, some more than others, right? So for some people who may not be able to meet that test for capacity independently, what other jurisdictions have recognized is that they can implement a legal framework which allows people to rely on others for support
Right.
in the decision-making process, right?
Okay.
So, for example,
Formally.
formally,
Right. So
formal,
if we
legally recognized supports.
right. So to pick on my son's circumstance, so if he turns 18, he wants to lease a car, he
Yep.
could come back to me and go to people and have conversations about what he wants to do.
Right.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But
I hope he's doing that.
he's not doing any of it, but this is all hypothetical. I don't want to give him any ideas. But in the circumstance where a person has a disability, and that's sort of an informal check-in, and then you sign and you're responsible,
Correct.
or you can make that call. You're in this circumstance, there's the suggestion that you could formally set up those structures where people can consult with, and that wouldn't get in the. Explain it. You'll explain
exactly.
it better than I.
So the same thing. Like, your son comes to you and asks for some advice. He can then take your advice or not and go back to the other party, go back to the car dealership and sign the paper. Person with a disability can have those conversations as well. But the other party, right? The bank, the CRA, the car dealer, the healthcare practitioner may not think that they are then capable of executing on that, right? So they'll say, well, we can't take direction from you. We can't take direction from you because we don't think you meet this cognitive test of capacity. And therefore, somebody else has to make that decision for you, right? What we're trying to say is we need a legal framework that recognizes the fact that that person with a disability is going out to get the support, and that support can be legally recognized. And this isn't novel, right? Like this has existed for decades. It just hasn't existed here. And so, like, some very practical examples of how this plays out in everyday life is that a person goes to the bank to open a bank account, and they are not able to open that bank account, right? Because the bank doesn't want to contract with them. And I'm not necessarily blaming the banks, right? Because they're saying, look, how are we legally protected if like we are facing a degree of exposure, perhaps they would argue, by opening a bank account for someone who they do not think is capable of doing so, based on our legal constructs. And so we have no sort of we don't have a law here that would support the banks or support the person in gaining the
so the liability all
to open
lies
that
with
bank
them.
account.
So who's doing it well?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of jurisdictions here in Canada that have made a lot of progress over the last 20 or 30 years. I think there are a number of international jurisdictions as well who have implemented supported decision-making. So I always reference the Representation Agreement Act out in British Columbia that's been in place for decades that, essentially says, a person can rely on supports from a trusted friend or family member who's able to interpret their will and preference. Right. So they can interpret their will and preference. They can provide that support. Opening the bank account's not an issue. Accessing the RDSP is not an issue. Applying for the DTC is not an issue because there's this legally recognized framework in place.
Okay.
A number of other jurisdictions across Canada, the Yukon has made progress, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, you know,
Okay.
so
I
it's just that for
yeah,
whatever reason here in Ontario, we're not moving
we're
the
not
needle.
there. Yeah, I mentioned I was at a conference a year or so ago, and there was a presentation from a group in Colombia and another South American country. I don't recall. They had it in place too. It was miles ahead of us.
Miles ahead
Um,
of us. And what's interesting is that for a number of those jurisdictions, and in addition to a number of, I would say, states down in the U.S., they've relied on Canadian experts. They've relied on
really?
some of our legal frameworks, like the Representation Agreement Act, to build their legislation, to develop their legislation, right? So we've got
So
these
we just
international communities.
we've got a real opportunity here in Ontario to take some great ideas and some good frameworks and implement them in this province.
Absolutely. Yeah, we
Okay,
don't have to look too far.
well, let's do that.
You know, I think, and there are a number of people here in Ontario who've been advocating for split
Yeah.
decision-making frameworks for years. The Law
Well,
Commission of
you're
Ontario,
one of them.
yeah,
For sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
we've been doing that here, and you know, we sort of we're at the table. The Law Commission of Ontario
Good.
had a 4-year project between, I think it was sort of 2014 and 2018, where they studied this area of law.
Right.
Um, Unfortunately, I don't know that any real impactful recommendations in relation to supported decision making resulted from that study, but a lot of the groundwork was done, right? So a lot of that groundwork's been done. A lot of the legal analysis has been done. Like I said, there are a lot of Canadian experts
Okay.
that have, you know, assisted other jurisdictions across the country and internationally in developing these legal frameworks. So I think the time is right here for Ontario, especially because uh, you know, we've got this RDSP issue that is coming to a head.
Right.
People have been facing issues accessing RDSPs since they came about in 2008, if their legal
Right.
capacity was being questioned.
Right.
The federal government sort of temporarily plugged that gap with by allowing for family members to act as plan holders. But that legislation is coming to an end on
Okay.
December 31st of this year.
Oh, okay. So
Uh,
it's pretty urgent.
it's pretty urgent. So the
Okay.
hope is that, you know, Ontario is working on something to ensure that that eligibility for RDSPs aren't impacted beyond
Okay.
this year. Yeah.
Okay. We'll have to leave it there. We've covered a lot of ground, took some time.
Okay.
Always good to catch up and chat about issues. I'm sure we'll have you back and chat some more.
Yeah, no, it's always wonderful being here. Feel free to call anytime. Would love to continue
Yeah.
the conversation.
Yeah. And thanks for the work that you're doing across the country and in the province. And it's great to be able to pick your brain and use your expertise and share that with people. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Brad. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you for listening, watching, and sharing. We release a new episode of Community Chats on the 15th and the 30th of each month, so don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date.